Going green isn't an option anymore. It's an obligation. Each one of us must embrace for a sustainable future.
It's easy to think that transitioning to a green economy might be expensive, but it won't. Though not transitioning will be tremendously expensive.
I believe the cause of going green is about making smart and fair choices to protect active communities, their culture and the environment, creating a sustainable future for everyone.
The ambitious climate targets have due dates that are really close. 2030 is just around the corner. 2050 will be so too. So we need to accelerate our progression. We still need development of technologies, and we still need development of infrastructure. But just as important, we need development of our governance and policies.
Regarding the green shift, we have enough knowledge that we need to act. The fuel will very likely increase in cost. We expect the cost to increase in order of 3 to 10 times. This will definitely foster radical innovations in terms of new ship concepts, but also alternative propulsion methods. And also we have to look into, is all these transportations we are doing today really needed?
Good morning. Yeah, you can hear me. Good morning, everyone. Oh, yeah. We have reaction from the audience. That means you're all awake and didn't stay up too late, yesterday. Welcome again, last day. And of course, at the last day, we have the big picture very early in the morning, to keep the entertainment and the discussion fresh. Talking about fresh discussions. Thanks for being back with us, Rita.
Thank you.
What were your big surprises after 2 days in Tromsø at the Arctic Frontiers?
Well, thankfully, not too many major surprises, but maybe a couple of highlights. At least one of them that stood out for me was one of yesterday's sessions, the one that explored how we move beyond traditional security. I thought it was very timely and quite an eye-opening, honest and candid discussion with Norway's foreign minister and all the others on stage about how we look at new ways of adapting to this changing climate, to the hybrid threats that we were talking about. And of course, the geopolitical race is on in and around the Arctic Ocean among all the major powers. So very much an interesting topic for me, and I hope for everyone else as well. And we have 2 more really exciting topics to end on.
Yeah, excellent. And as you might remember, we do a recap of all the breakout sessions afterwards, where we discuss what has happened here and record it so you can rewatch the sessions kind of in a way. And what stood out for me was there, as a semi, or what I heard as a senior youth, as I refer to myself nowadays, I tend to be rather cynical from time to time, But in all the discussion, we often talked about trust and being an optimistic realist, And I think that was like 2 themes and 2 phrases that stood out also in the previous big pictures. So maybe we'll hear the same optimistic realism.
True. How to build trust, and it's good to have so many young emerging leaders as well with
Senior
us.
Young. Yeah.
Senior young.
Yeah. All right. Enjoy.
Count me in with you. Thank you, Andreas. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to this big picture session where we explore the cost of going green. Now, of course, as the planet's thermostat rises, the Arctic, once a symbol of untouched wilderness, is bearing the brunt of climate change. The imperative of moving towards carbon-neutral societies is undeniable. But let's be honest, it comes with a hefty price tag. In fact, I was just looking at some statistics earlier as I was having breakfast, and some of them were quite startling. In fact, the estimates for just how much the green transition will cost vary greatly, but they do range between 100 trillion to 300 trillion between now and 2050. So on average, about $2 trillion a year. And putting it in context, apparently the current annual global GDP is 100 trillion. Having said that, the question isn't just whether we can afford to It's whether we can afford not to move ahead with the transition. Transitioning to sustainable energy systems demands trillions of dollars in investment, yes, and our current economic system, as we all know, prioritizes capital and growth, often at the expense of the environment. It's a fact. So are we strategically allocating resources, or are we merely throwing money at symptoms without addressing the root causes? Are we making genuine commitments or employing more greenwashing tactics? But the Arctic's transformation isn't just about the environment. It's also a socio-economic upheaval. Indigenous communities whose livelihoods and cultures are intricately tied to the land often face existential threats. So how can we champion a green transition that doesn't trample on the rights and traditions of these communities? Are they really, as someone mentioned to me yesterday, are they really standing in the face of progress? Are they putting up obstacles, or do they have real valid concerns about the way things are being done? The Arctic, of course, has a major role to play in the green transition, not just strategically because it unites several continents, but because of the abundance of assets for renewable energy. So how do we move forward? What solutions are there? Here's a look at where things stand according to the Climate Policy Institute, what the costs of mitigation, adaptation, and/or inaction may be.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Baisanara, and I lead the Climate Policy Initiative's Global Climate Finance Tracking Program in London. So at CPI, we combine rigorous analysis with real-world expertise to understand where global climate finance stands today and to design innovative financial tools and policies that can guide the world toward a sustainable future. So today, I'm very happy to share some insights from our flagship publication called Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which is the most comprehensive overview and data on global climate investment. So we'll take a look at the progress made to date on climate investments, the evidence on the cost of inaction, and where opportunities lie to catalyze real change. So going straight into the findings, our numbers tell a mixed story. So annual climate finance flows reached almost 1.3 trillion on average, nearly doubling compared to 4 years ago. So much of this growth has been driven by accelerated investment in climate mitigation, which include investments into clean energy, transport, and building sector. Now, this is a significant step forward, but let's put this into perspective. 1.3 trillion represents only about 1% of global GDP. Now contrast this to what's needed. To keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, annual climate finance needs to grow to about $9 trillion by 2030. Now that's a 5-fold increase, and every year of delay only makes the task harder. And some of us might think, well, this is an enormous amount of cost. Why should we do this? Where do we get so much money? And does this even make economic sense? Our research makes one thing abundantly clear. Inaction is far costlier. Delaying climate transition investment now will only lead to higher costs down the line. So from whichever angle you measure it, whether it's physical damage, productivity losses, or economic opportunities, if we do not take the action that is needed, will cost us much, much more than addressing climate change head-on ever will. Now, what do we mean by cost of inaction? So broadly, costs of inaction fall into 2 categories, economic and social. So economic costs include direct losses to GDP due to climate-related risks and impacts. For example, physical assets and productive lands are being lost due to extreme weather events and rising seas, while labor productivity and agricultural yields will decrease as temperatures rise. Social costs include indirect costs incurred due to negative climate-related impacts on people and their environments. Now consider this. If we don't meet today's climate finance needs, we risk losing over 2,300 trillion in global economic output in about 75 years. On the other hand, if we do meet the current climate finance needs, nearly half of these losses can be avoided, not just saving trillions, but also countless lives. While there are certain costs that we're able to translate into economic terms, There are costs that are simply unmeasurable. So things like loss of human lives, loss of biodiversity, or cultural heritage, which are all at risk. But the good news is that by meeting climate finance needs, we not only avoid costs, we can unlock opportunities. And investing today means seizing a share of that growth while building resilience for future generations. Now let's take a look at another most pressing challenges we face. Cost of green transition is not just about scaling investment to reduce emissions, but it's also about adapting to the impacts of climate change. So it's already happening, and millions of people all around the world, as well as ecosystems and communities, are already bearing the brunt of the burden. And the Arctic is particularly vulnerable, and implications in the region also impact the global climate. So adaptation finance interventions such as improving adaptive resilience of communities, building early warning systems and infrastructure resilient to floods, permafrost thaw, or wildfires are needed today. And while adaptation finance reached an all-time high of $76 billion most recently, this still falls far short of estimated needs of $212 billion per year by 2030 for developing countries alone. Now, to conclude with, our research shows that the landscape of climate finance is evolving rapidly, and this brings an unprecedented chance to align investment with innovation, sustainability, and resilience. Meeting the challenges of the green transition is not just a cost, it's an opportunity. Our collective role here today is to bring evidence on the cascading impacts of climate change on our financial systems, public budgets, business supply chains, and lead with solutions to foster action and collaboration among public and private actors to help them align our financial flows with our climate goals. There's no lack of money in the system, but lack of the right incentives and political will. So thank you very much, and I wish you a productive session today.
So then this is the outlook. What concrete steps can we take? The session will focus on economic, political, and environmental shifts required to make this green transition. Let me invite to the stage our panelists, Max Morgan, who is Business Development Director at Norton Energy, which is Sweden's gas transmission systems operator, Dr. Mari Sundlitveit, Chief Executive of the Research Council of Norway and President of Science Europe, Hilde Rød, Senior Vice President, Climate and Sustainability at Equinor, and last but not least, Lotta Numellen, Permit Manager at OX2 Åland. She's also a marine biologist. Welcome to all of you. Gentlemen first. Max, if I can begin with you. You've been described to me at least as a visionary. But for those who are still skeptical, not fully on board with this green transition, what do you say to them, and what is holding them back? Is it a question of cost or commitment?
Thank you very much, Gita. Visionary, that's far too generous. I should begin by saying that whatever I say today is going to be my personal opinion and no one else's. I find it useful to put my ignorance in some sort of context. It'll save a lot of time later on. Why are we not progressing? Is it cost or commitment? I'm very much in the camp of commitment. My own feeling is that we're going about this the wrong way. You know, we're trying to say, how do we come up with the right equation, the right numbers that catalyze action in order to prevent certain exceeding a threshold by 2030, 1.5 degrees C. Well, how's it going? 2024, we exceeded 1.5. So the equation is evolving. Are our approaches working? Are we evolving? So essentially, people say, my trouble with the video and the approach is that it's focused a lot on cost and numbers, and that concerns me in two ways. The first way is I believe that sometimes costs can be used as a delaying tactic. Now, I understand, of course, people immediately attack me and say, oh, he's a long-haired hippie who doesn't care about economics, obviously. But no, I worked in finance for over 10 years, so I'm very comfortable with discussions about numbers. But I believe they can be distracting because you cannot come up with a valuation that is viewed universally. Someone will always view it as a risk. Someone else will always view it as an opportunity. Look at just recently DeepSeek. You have NVIDIA, lost $500 billion in value, the next day bounced back. There's always a subjective prism when looking at businesses and how you value risk. So that's my trouble with the delaying tactic of numbers. But the second part, I'm more uncomfortable if we are starting to present what we need to do as an opportunity. An opportunity for what? More profit? You know, Kurt Vonnegut wrote despairingly saying, we're going to go down in history as the first society that didn't save itself because it wasn't cost effective. If you were alive today, I'm not sure if it'd feel better if you wrote, we were the first society that decided to save itself because the profits were just too eye-watering. I don't think that's the way. So just let me end with this provocative way to say, does this approach work? Can you answer a moral question through a spreadsheet? Imagine it's not 2025 in Norway. Imagine it's 1860 in America. And looking at the media today, that's actually quite easy to do. But it's 1860 in America, and we all have decided that slavery is wrong. Finally, we say, this cannot continue. And everyone gets on board. Society, business leaders, corporates say, this must end. But the cost. Tell me a little bit more. Well, we need to work on the numbers, but hang on, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's see if these steam machines come down and cost a little bit before action. And we dutifully do the numbers and we go back and they say, yes, but this season's cotton crop wasn't great. We need the margins a bit higher. We'll get around to it. And pretty soon you start to say, I thought we had commitment. Why so much discussion on the cost? So that's my view.
So we talk about cost, but you also bring up the moral dimension. What is for you the most important part of the equation? Is it the financial cost or the moral imperative? Can they go hand in hand?
I believe that they have to go together. This is my view. Whenever someone comes at me with hard questions on costs, I always say, happy to talk about costs, but then let's have a little discussion about your commitment. Now, why is this important? Because we've seen the current landscape right now. We're not making progress. Why? Look at corporate America, and I don't mean to pick on them, but 10 years ago, big commitment to diversity and other targets. Today, they're running a race saying, no, we don't believe in diversity anymore. Somehow, equality between men and women, it depends on the political season. Commitment can change. Has there been progress? 90% of boards are still dominated by men, so you can't exactly say the scale went too far the other way. So what I'm saying to you is that sometimes we talk a good talk, but without the commitment, we don't actually make progress.
That's too true. Commitment, political commitment, often missing. Dr. Mary, from what you just heard, and looking at the fact that this issue, the move towards a green transition, does require time, doesn't it? It's not something that happens overnight. So for a lot of people, it's sort of in the distance. They do not see the immediate economic, you do see the immediate economic and political costs, but not necessarily the benefits. How do you get around that? And how do you create a more fair transition, which is what the young generation is asking for, a just and fair transition?
Yeah. And that is what we have to be able to have, a just and fair transition.
Can we have
yes,
it? Or is it
yes,
too idealistic?
No, I don't think it's too idealistic, and I do think I agree with you 100%. You have to keep that moral imperative within you to try to do the right things at every little. We're talking about these numbers, and you see the graphs, and yes, it's going to be costly in financial terms, but that's also an opportunity. But what's hiding behind those numbers is zillions and zillions of big and small decisions regarding actions to actually make that transition. And that is when we have to make the right choices. And there are very, very, very many decision makers here that has to be put in a position where they can make the right choices for that transition. And so you need knowledge, and you need to make that knowledge available to all those decision makers. And sometimes they're politicians, sometimes they're business leaders, sometimes they're NGOs. Sometimes we all need more knowledge. It's very easy for me as the head of the Research Council to say that. But that is actually, and you said it feels like it's in the distant future, or to me, it's like it feels like it's in my face. The sustainability goals that when the UN, that decision was made by the UN. I believe it felt like far into the distance at that time, but now it's less than 5 years. There is no time. We need immediate actions, and all of those small and big actions has to be right. So what we do in the Research Council is that that is always our backdrop. And all of these problems are wicked problems. It's not like, the climate can be solved there, and the nature and the pollution crises can be solved there, and then there's the just future for everyone, and respecting indigenous people, and also respecting all people. And putting the whole social dimension in there, making it possible for politicians who have a leading role in this. And that's not to take the responsibility away from the business sector, because I think they could really be front runners. But the politicians, we need to make it possible for them to be elected and re-elected with solutions that are good for people, that are good for future lives, because if not, it's just not going to happen. So how can we work with the research communities to come up with all those different solutions to the wicked problems? And I could, I could go on for 3 hours, not 3 minutes.
Wicked is a good
but I'll just break it through to you that this is something that I literally talk about and think about every day. And we are a comprehensive research council, which means that we get the money from all the ministries in Norway and we channel it into projects. 11, 12 billion Norwegian kroner per year, which is not like the $2 trillion that we need, but still, it's money, so we need to make sure that that's put into the right projects, and that means that we need to have mechanisms to create speed, direction, commitment, bringing people together. All of these things are things that we work with.
So, I don't even know where to begin, because you said so many interesting things, and here I am trying to follow with you and catch up. But on several fronts, one, you told us about some of the concrete steps that councils like yours are taking. Of course, the climate issue is in everyone's face when you live here in the Arctic. It's so obvious. But of course, say that to someone across the world in Bangladesh, they may not see it that way. Or other places. Again, it's a global collective commitment. You talk about the importance of having politicians act on the data, on the science, on the research. We know that politicians have their eyes set on the next election.
They do.
How do you get around this? But to the point of speed, you mentioned speed. Research and innovation, we know, are both pivotal to the green transition, but one goes faster than the other.
That's true.
Research tends to lag behind.
Yeah, well, research, I think research has research has been everywhere in the journey that we've had up until this point on understanding the climate crisis, on modeling it, on seeing into the future, on making the foundations within. Let's go back to the UN and the climate negotiations. I think that's one of the political processes where they're actually where research is actually embedded in there. Doesn't make it the decision doesn't automatically come from that, but the scientific foundation is there. But as you say, research is sometimes very slow processes. I need to make sure that it's not slow because it's not funded, because that's one of the reasons that sometimes it takes a lot of time. But yes, it takes time, but it's also possible to speed up that transition from new knowledge to actual use. How can we work that in our mechanisms? That's something that we think about a lot. And I think that's bringing the communities, bringing the action makers, bringing them closer in and into the research. And we talk about citizen science, but we also talk about bringing all the actors together so that the results can be taken immediately into action. So there are ways of speeding it up. You know, faster things than having a report and hope someone reads it. You know.
And one of the engines, I suppose, to speeding it up is the private sector. Hilde wrote, Equinor is one of the biggest providers of energy, and you are leading the company's transition plans. And I understand that the company has announced its ambition to become a net zero company by 2050. Now, it's a little bit odd because as a major player in the oil and gas industry, how do you reconcile some of your ongoing fossil fuel projects with these climate commitments? Can you do both at once?
Very good question, and one that we get quite a lot. So, but first of all, thanks for having me here, and thanks for having a discussion on this topic of the costs of going green. I think it's a very important topic and something that we need to discuss to be able to really speed up the transition, because that's what we need. And I think the film we saw summarizes the challenge very well with there's a tremendous need for investments, and yet we know the costs of inactions are bigger, and that leaves us all with the question, why are we not doing more faster? And that goes to us as a company, but it goes to also society. And I think we talked about cost or commitment, and I think we need definitely both, and we need more of both. But I do think also discussing cost is important to understand where it's lagging and how we can speed up transition. And then I think of cost in the broader sense in terms of trade-offs, in terms of the complexity of changing the energy system, lack of collaboration internationally, the geopolitical climate, etc. But this is about prioritization in the end. We are an energy company, so I'll take that perspective to it. We have 50 years of experience, mainly from oil and gas production and mainly in Norway, and providing energy, providing jobs, etc. We want to be a company that also creates value and creates job and provides energy 50 years from now. That means we need to fundamentally change our business and business model. And that's challenging. And that's the same challenge as the world is facing, because a lot of emissions are, they are stemming from the energy system. And there's been trillions going into investments in renewable energy over the last few years, and that's great. But so far, we're still in a process where we're adding energy to the system, and the energy mix is still pretty much the same, because energy is in everything we do, and it's still 80% fossil fuel based, and it takes time to change this, also with a growing world population. So we're trying to grow in renewables, in low carbon solutions, etc., but we see that the pace of change is not where it should be. And there are what we've seen lately. A few years back, the focus was very much on climate, also in a European context, in discussions around energy. Then, over the past few years, the balance has shifted somewhat. And some of this has to do with the security situation, and particularly in Europe. We saw with the invasion of Ukraine, Europe went into an energy crisis or crunch, soaring energy prices. And I think the discussion now is much more around how do you reduce emissions but still provide energy security? How do you address affordability and not looking just at sort of climate as in isolation? And that means prioritization also for governments in budgets. And on top of this, we have a nature crisis. And to really succeed, we need to build up renewables at a scale the world has never seen before. And that requires land use, and that's difficult, because then you come into nature and coexistence issues. So how do we do all of this at scale?
And it becomes overwhelming when you think of everything that needs to be done. It is far easier to say, okay, I as a company will make these commitments. But to Mox's point about a lot of people, companies, governments, talking the talk, but not really quite walking the walk. You mentioned the need to overhaul your business model. But to what extent do you need a fundamental overhaul of your core business model? In other words, without sugarcoating it, are you on track? Are you really doing enough, fast enough?
We are definitely doing what we can and looking for ways to do more. We're currently in execution of 3 major renewable projects, including the world's largest offshore wind farm. So there is a lot going on. We've just opened the Northern Lights facility, the world's first storage for third-party volumes of CO2, also in Norway. So there are groundbreaking projects that are tangible and going on. But of course, we would like to do even more faster, but we do not want to do that by shutting down energy supply that is needed in Europe. So we see that oil and gas, for example, will be needed for a long time going forward, also in a net zero society. So for us, that is really about doing that as responsibly as possible and cutting emissions as much as we can while we build out the alternatives. We strongly believe you need to build out the alternatives before you can really stop the oil and gas, but we need to provide oil and gas as responsibly as possible.
Lotta Nemelen, as a marine biologist working in the Baltic Sea, you are involved with a lot of renewable energy projects. How do you address the potential ecological disturbances caused by large-scale installations like offshore wind farms? Can we really talk about green projects if some of these projects disrupt marine ecosystems?
Thank you. I am bringing an example from Åland, so now you get the whole package from the great visions to the concrete examples. And I'm really happy to be here. I really enjoyed my time here in Tromsø, and even though we are not part of the Arctic, I still see a lot of similarities coming from a small island with a small society, also struggling with communication and mobility. But I work for Ox2, which is a developer of renewable energy in our office in Åland. And we, as many other developers, have the ambition of being nature positive in all our projects. And as a marine biologist working in one of the projects, this task kind of ended up in my lap, and I got the mission to actually walk the walk and not only talk the talk. So we started figuring out how on earth do we make offshore wind nature positive. And we started by just testing, trying stuff out to see what can we do to actually, if we do like business as usual, is there a difference if we actually take actions to increase biodiversity? We are working now in an area which is deep, dark, soft sediments, naturally very low in biodiversity. We are going to introduce a hard surface, sunlit. Something is going to grow, but can we, by our measures, make the key species of the Baltic Sea, the bladder wrack, the blue mussel, inhabit these, and also then maybe get the herring to enjoy itself there, the cod, other really important species for us. So the idea was, can we try to combat climate change, but at the same time also combat the loss of biodiversity? And how cool wouldn't that be if we would be able to combine the two? And when we were doing this out in our little test site, that of course also caught the eye of the business modelers in our company, because they thought it was really fun to go out there, but also thought that what we were doing were kind of interesting. And then we started having the discussions that can actually these biodiversity measures be something more than just nice to have, stakeholder management, and actually be included in the business calculations. And we got a project funded by Nordic Innovation to actually look into business models of multi-use and also biodiversity credits. If we succeed in actually getting more biodiversity, would that be something that we could start trading with, buying, selling? And as a biologist, when we're working with nature, usually the resources are not very big, and it's usually government money or something like that. If we could start getting the attention of businesses to actually see that the biodiversity could have something to do, it could be a line in the business calculation, we would unleash a completely new kind of resource for working with nature and biodiversity. So,
on a practical level, though, these biodiversity credits, how would they work? I mean, they are seen as a tool for valuing nature, But do you feel that you would need laws and regulation
Absolutely.
to allow businesses and communities to exchange
Absolutely.
these?
Yeah, because
how would that work?
yeah, we still have a lot to do when it comes to standardizing, verifying. In order to be able to trade it, we need to have a secure system that we know works, that it's not only greenwashing, that we can actually measure it. And that's not something that we as companies should do. It should be done by experts doing that and third parties verifying that. So yes, we need to work a lot with the verification and of biodiversity, and we still have a lot to do, but it's a really, really interesting journey to actually start finding out what is biodiversity. As a biologist, I thought I knew what the concept meant, but then when you start thinking, okay, is this species more valuable than this? Then you ask the science and they say, well, it's the function of the system. And then you're like, oh no, that is far too complicated. Now we need to kind of get down to small pieces again to really see what we will do on the foundations of our offshore wind. So complex, but so interesting.
But doable. I want you all to sort of comment on anything you've heard.
May I? Yes, thank you. Yes, very interesting. I mean, we do fund a lot of projects like the one that Lotta is describing, which is very interesting. We fund a lot of projects within the business sector, and a lot of them are to do with the green and digital transition. So we do fund a lot of projects to look at actual solutions. So it's not only about understanding what's going on with the climate and how it connects with nature, with all the trade-offs and dilemmas that we come into. It's not only between the different species. I'm a landscape ecologist, so that was very much talking to me. but also between different dimensions of society, and how do we make it just? How do we bring all these things together? And I'm coming back to these mechanisms and how we do things, because we find that bringing people together, researchers together, in larger centers, like bridging, because all these issues are cross-sectoral, wicked problems. We have to bring people together and also the users so that you could get that fast actual transition.
And on-the-ground research.
On-the-ground research that is about finding the actual solutions from breakthrough, groundbreaking research, but onto actual solutions and bringing it together, allowing that bridging, because it's hard for the business sector to do that alone. It's hard for the researchers to do that alone. But if you come in with funding, you can bridge and make that transition of knowledge much faster, because that's actually, I think that's a very sticky part of the actual green transition, is the transition of knowledge.
So bridging the divides, going beyond borders, quite literally, Mox. I know you have worked on a lot of renewable energy projects in Sweden, but also across the world, in Asia. It's not a one-size-fits-all, is it?
Definitely not. We need to come up with customized solutions. But again, that is not a reason not to act. It's not as though, again, we haven't come up with a magic formula that can be applied in every situation. I'd go back to, again, what your opening statements, Gita, were, that what's lacking, cost or commitment. To me, it really still is about commitment. And let me again point out another example, perhaps, of a cost-based approach. Use the example of the American healthcare system, and I apologize, I know there's some Americans here, I'm not just picking on you. But for most people in the world, healthcare is too important to be run on a profit basis. America says otherwise. It's all about profit. Now, what does that deliver? Does it deliver the best healthcare in the world? No, it delivers the most expensive healthcare in the world with suboptimal outcomes. Lower child mortality, higher child mortality, many are lower life expectancy. To the rest of the world would say, well, that's crazy, it's healthcare. Why would you run that on a profit basis? Well, I'd say if healthcare is too important to run on a profit basis, why are we dealing with our own existence on that basis, saying, well, let's go back to that spreadsheet and work on it again. For the film buffs out there, I feel that we're like in Interstellar, Dr. Brand working on the equation that can't be solved. It's actually a sham. It's a delaying tactic. So that's my view.
Good point, putting people at the center of things rather than the bottom line. But,
I wanted to pick up also on Mari's comments around more these permitting processes, and we talk about, is it cost that's the hurdle, and I think every time we discuss renewables, and offshore wind is where we are engaged, it's, one of the main problems is, first of all, you need projects to actually bid on to be able to do more, and there hasn't been a whole lot of that, so governments actually need to also make projects available for the private sector to. We can't just go and build wherever we want. And then we're now starting production this year at Dogger Bank in the UK, which is the world's largest offshore wind farm. We were awarded these areas in, I think it was 2013. That's 12 years ago. And that's, in a way, the time it takes with all the permitting, consenting, etc. And it's so important to get these processes right, but we also don't have that time available. So how can you do this in a way that's really inclusive, with meaningful stakeholder engagement, and also addressing nature aspects, but speeding it up? And is it possible to do it in a more holistic way? And I think we have some experience there from ocean management in Norway. But I think that is also something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I was thinking, we have discussed cooperation. I think that's been one of the keywords throughout these seminars. And it's been the keyword for so many seminars I've been in. I was thinking, what's so difficult? Why is this something that we are kind of lacking? And of course, cooperation is difficult. You have to discuss with people who don't think like you do. It takes time. You need to compromise. It's much faster to do stuff yourself, your own way. That's something that when we are, for example, talking about these biodiversity credits and costs, now when we biologists need to discuss with economists, oh my, that's difficult because the language is so different and we are struggling to understand each other. And that also comes with science, because science is something we definitely need. We need to base stuff on that. Still, science is quite slow. The funding is extremely slow. And in order to solve issues and like for us, testing, just seeing what happens, we really need to kind of work with the cooperation, because our worlds are so different, and it's really difficult to match them together. Cooperation, yes, but it's tricky. It's not coming by itself.
Can I jump in there, please, Gita, on that? I do not underestimate the importance of science, economic models, all of this. But again, I say, if our focus is in the right area, these are secondary considerations. To quote Sweden's most famous expert, Greta Thunberg, she urged people to act as though the house is on fire. And I think there's a brilliance in that statement, because when the house is on fire, what happens? Firstly, it's urgent. You don't form a subcommittee that meets bi-weekly to discuss the needs to address the fire. You act on the fire. The second thing is, you don't let cost dominate. You don't ring 3 fire brigades to see which has the lowest cost of water and then form a committee to decide which is the most cost effective. You call the fire department, you act. And lastly, it's all of us are in it. So if I'm on the second floor and I put out the fire in my bedroom, I then lie on the bed and say, well, I'm done. No, you say the whole damn house is on fire. How else can I help? You get involved. And so that goes back to commitment. So just one example on saying that science, all of this is important. We have a recent example, though, COVID. Show me the cost-benefit analysis before governments shut down global airspace, shut all trade, confined us to our homes. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm saying that drastic action is possible. Was it done for the right reasons? Maybe. But it was fear-driven. No one waited for a scientific study to show this is the best approach. They said, good enough. Close everything. So we can take almost unthinkable action if we have the will.
If we have the will.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Yes. I'll try to be very brief. I'll just mention a couple of things that I think we haven't. You were sort of going a little bit in that direction. We need to work with systemic changes also of the economic system now, thinking specifically about circularity and the fact that we have to take out a lot less new resources from from the natural system. So that is one important systemic change. And I think, the House on Fire is a very good thing, and I do agree with all of what you're saying, but some of these things are not that, it's further away from that sort of very, that logic. So we need to help making people, able to solve much more complex equations than that. Then I want to just say that we need to work very carefully with the just transition. We need to work with the social parts of this, and we need to work very closely with equitable partnerships and reciprocity, bringing people into the research so that we find, because there's so many dimensions here that you could, the fast action can just also just overrun some very important dimensions here. So it has to be careful, but fast.
Speaking of running out of time, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So it's a challenge to all of you, but literally in 30 or 40 seconds. Your final thoughts, and if I could quickly just maybe throw in a couple of ideas from the audience here that you may or may not sort of allude to in your final remarks. Some are saying we've had the facts that the climate threat is dire and looming for years, and that hasn't motivated many stakeholders. What piece of information will it take to snap them into action? Is there any one finding that will motivate decision makers? And then another one, and feel free to touch on whichever one you like. It appears essential to also have a plan for reducing our society's overall amount of rhythm, of resource and energy consumption. Otherwise, innovation projects are simply an added layer to our collective consumption capacity. How do you feel about that? How concerned are you by this issue? Or is it mostly a matter for government policies and legislation? Do we pass the buck or do we take it head on? Your thoughts?
Oh, so many interesting thoughts.
30 seconds.
Coming from the environmental movement, of course, I think that reducing the use of natural resources and energy should be priority number one, of course. Unfortunately, we see, especially with these different kinds of use of data and AI and everything, it doesn't seem like that's the way we are heading. I think the energy production is, we are going to need so much more in order to deal with all that. So we also need ways to do this in a smart way.
How do we snap into action?
We stop being afraid of failure and be more brave and just trying different paths and thinking outside the box. I think we are far too afraid to fail.
Throwing caution to the wind.
Yes, so I think it's right that there is a sort of fundamental behavior change that is needed. Our lifestyles, we're consuming too much, and I think that's very much the root cause of this. But I also think we need, in the spirit of optimistic realism, there was talk of that. I do think it's possible to find ways with policies, frameworks, etc., to really make the current economic system also work better for climate by incentivizing the right things. And I think we haven't fully exploited that ability. That's when the private sector really can scale up things.
Who needs to be in the driver's seat?
I think
public or private sector?
No, I think it needs to be both.
Yeah, it has to be both. Yeah, and then, it has to be both. And that's why I'm going to, the 30 seconds, I'm going to bring a little hobby horse of mine into this panel. And that is public procurement. Because the public procurement, goods and services that the public sector is buying every year, money already spent every year. I don't know if you know how much it is, but in Norway, a small country, it's coming up to 800 billion Norwegian kroner per year. Goods and services bought. That could be spent in the environmentally, the green and digital shift with the most innovation and research height you could possibly get. You could do that with every one of those kroner. That's money already on the table. That's my best tip.
Your tip.
By all means, continue to work on numbers, but at the same time as numbers, don't forget accountability. Let us hold ourselves through our actions, our personal consumptions, but also our leaders who have expressed commitment, companies expressed commitment hold them accountable. We need to act, and they have committed to do so.
Yeah.
So where is it?
So vote for action.
Indeed.
Right.
On this note, thank you very much to all of our panelists.
Very good.
Gives us a lot of things to think about as to how we need to act. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So before we invite to the stage our second set of panelists, let's take a look at how we actually achieve some of this accountability and how we create a good transition.
What has been the cost of not going green? Can you put a price on a mountain or a glacier?
Picture this. The year is 2023. 20,000 people are evacuated from Yellowknife, Canada, where wildfires burned 136,000 acres of land, twice the size of Copenhagen. The year is 2024. The Alaska Native community of Shishmaref has to evacuate their homes and traditional lands that they've lived on forever, as the shoreline retreats by meters per year. The year is 2030. What if I told you now all of this is happening to your home and your community? What would you be willing to do today?
At the same time, what has been the cost of going green? We allow wind turbines to be built on Sami reindeer grazing lands without their leadership and participation. We construct massive hydroelectric dams, displacing Cree and Inuit peoples from their traditional hunting, fishing, and trapping territories. We should not value money over people and ecosystem to bear the burden of a green transition. We should have done this differently. Why wasn't this done?
What does timely and inclusive action look like to you?
Hvordan kan vi sikre at omstillingen skjer på en rettferdig og hurtig måte?
Comment agir concrètement et rapidement pour garantir une transition juste et durable?
In cosa consiste ai vostri occhi un'azione inclusiva e tempestiva?
Hoe ziet inclusieve en directe actie eruit voor jou?
आपकी नज़र में भविष्य कैसा लगता है?
Hvordan kan vi sikre, at omstillingen sker på en retfærdig og hurtig måde?
¿Cómo definirían una acción inclusiva y oportuna?
Imagine what inclusive and timely action could look like.
Cries from the heart. We should have done this differently. Is it too late to change course? Or is now the time to actually do things differently? How do we ensure a timely and fair transition? We'll discuss all of this and more with our next set of panelists, and they are Aili Keskitalo, who is Senior Advisor at Amnesty International Norway, Richard Rudden, Head of Green Solutions at Gallagher Renewable Energy, an insurance company, Chip McCrimmon, founder partner of Bird and McCrimmon, an indigenous-owned management consulting firm which focuses on climate tech and sustainable development, and last but not least, Donovan Rusoniello, Outreach Director at Renewable Energy Alaska Project. Welcome. Let's go back to ladies first. Aili. Amnesty Norway, I know, has been working with Amnesty Sweden and Finland, as well as the Sami Council, for a stronger recognition and inclusion of their rights within energy politics. We talk a lot about value. Should we be talking more about values? How would you assess the picture today?
A very good point about talking about values, because human rights, in my view, are also about core values of humanity. And actually, we are here in Romsa, the Sami name of this town, because we yesterday launched our report together with the Sami Council, and this is the first ever report on indigenous Sami rights in the Nordics from Amnesty International, and it focuses on climate justice and land rights in the green transition that we are all talking about, and it's called Just Transition or Green Colonialism, and it's available at Amnesty Norway's website if you are interested. And this report tells kind of the same story that we heard from the youth voices just now. It tells the story of 3 human rights violations in the Nordics towards the Sami in the name of climate mitigation. 1 wind power project and 2 mineral extraction projects. And the climate crisis is a human rights crisis in more ways than one. It affects vulnerable communities more than others, like Arctic indigenous peoples. But the solutions must be applied with respect to indigenous peoples' human rights, to not create new problems. So our report describes the cost of going green when it comes to the consequences for Sami culture, for Sami livelihoods. And in our report, we give recommendations to the governments of Norway, Sweden, and Finland on how human rights tools, like indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, informed consent, must be used to secure what we are all hopefully working for, a just energy transition, and not a transition that reminds dangerously of colonial practices better left in the past. So we have analyzed the legislation in the 3 states, and even if there has been some improvement in the later years, in our view, these states do not live up to their human rights obligations. So that should also be the message to companies operating in these 3 states. Like the companies that are present here today, be aware and tread carefully, because you have to do your own due diligence, just not leave it to the states. So back to the values, it's also about who defines the values, who have the power to define value and the power to define cost.
And again, to the issue of justice and accountability, you mentioned climate justice. Are indigenous peoples carrying an unjust moral burden? And where does it leave the concept not just of burden sharing, but benefit sharing as well?
Interesting question. Well, when it comes to the burden, from a Sami perspective, the Sami stakeholders, right holders, they often tell a story about the burden of climate change when you have a livelihood that is nature-based, that is very risky business in these times. And then you have the burdens that are created through climate mitigation, like big industrial projects, energy projects, mineral extraction. So it's a double burden. And that's the story that they are often telling, also to us in Amnesty International. So it's a big burden to carry. And when voicing, maybe opposing new energy projects, the Sami, we are often told that we have a moral obligation. We owe it to the world to produce sustainable energy, to produce critical minerals. But then the historical context is forgotten. In the Sami areas, we have been producing energy for 100 years already, more than 100 years already. And also minerals have been extracted from Sami lands for hundreds of years already. So I think we kind of have contributed and paid our dues to the world already.
Richard Rudden, you see this from the other side. How to insure Arctic business? We know that insurance can be critical in managing the financial risks of climate change. Eili just spoke about some of the risks that the more vulnerable communities face. How can insurance companies be used positively as a tool to impact legislation in a way that protects everyone's rights?
Sure. Firstly, thanks for having me, and well done to Anu, Julia, and Frida for an amazing conference. It's great to be part of it, so thank you. insurance is fundamentally quite boring. I've been banned from talking about it at home by my wife, so hopefully I won't bore you too much. We sit on both sides. So the video at the start there talked about adaptation, mitigation. Insurers are the ones, at least in part, writing checks for some of the damage that's being done, and they're sitting there firsthand seeing the damage that climate change does. But also on the other side, they're open for business and want to de-risk capital and investment flows into green transition and solving the problem. If I think about just listing a few of those that I've seen certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, obviously we've talked about renewable technologies. You've got floating wind, floating solar, green and blue hydrogen projects, huge interconnect cables around energy security. Hilda mentioned CCUS projects. We've got a carbon credit product that we're developing at the moment, specifically around drawing capital into nature-based solutions, revenue protectors, performance guarantees, and then closing the protection gap, which is currently massive. If you look at the natural peril damage that was caused globally last year, that's 417 billion. Only 38% of that was insured. So we're also looking at ways that you can close that and affect communities for the positive. 9 billion a year was the number that we talked about there in that video that's needed. Insurance fundamentally de-risks, and it is a partnership. That was the other term that was used, collaboration. Insurers want to understand problems, they want to mitigate problems, but also they want to help solve novel new ways of drawing capital into a space. So hopefully we can talk about it more, but if you come away with something, and Mox was saying, where's the action, where's the commitment? This is only my second Arctic conference that I've come to, but I think I'm the only person, along with my colleague Will, who spoke at the multi-use panel yesterday. I think we're the only people who talk about it, and actually it's kind of sitting there in the shadows, and it should be used, and it can be used. From the indigenous communities point of view, we talked about this a bit yesterday, but one of the things we're talking about is, what about the ownership of indigenous communities having their own vehicle? Why do they need to come to insurers in, say, London and say, can we insure this project, or can you help us? Because the one thing that insurance does that no one ever thinks about is soft governance. So ACCA, Equinor are making huge strides in methane targets, for example. Insurers can sit there and say, are you actually doing what you said you do? Every year, every 12 months, a renewal comes up and policy comes in for insurance again. We can say, okay, let's just oversee this. Like, are you actually saying are you doing something that you said you do? So there's a lot that we can look at. There's a lot that we can help with. And if we can raise awareness in forums like this around what we can do, I know sometimes insurers don't have the best name, and I'm sorry if you've had a problem with your motor insurance, but hopefully you can kind of see that this is something that's designed to help.
So when you're back in your boardroom in London, quite detached from what's going on, right, in the Arctic, in the indigenous communities, what are the red lines for you when it comes to ensuring projects that are not accepted by the wider indigenous community? Does it even matter? Do you even factor that in?
It's a really good question. There is a massive problem with communication. So insurance companies, most insurance companies will make their own decisions. So let's take Arctic drilling as an example. Some insurers will say we won't insure new Arctic drilling. But I also know from talking to some of the audience that really negatively affects indigenous communities who rely sometimes on those natural resources. The point being, we need to kind of find a way of communicating. It is a transition. So if insurers are sitting there saying we don't touch it, and that negatively affects an indigenous community who rely on that natural resource, that's not a good thing. So what we need to do is not make the decisions in the boardrooms.
But are there red lines for you? Are you driven by, in the end, what the companies want and profit?
In my opinion, insurers shouldn't be the ones policing what's acceptable and what's not. What should happen is that we sit down and understand what affects communities and how it affects communities, and come up with a solution that way, not make decisions in isolation.
Chip, your company focuses on driving innovation and sustainability, but innovation often comes with steep costs, and we were just talking about that. Not just financial, but ethical as well. We heard Aili mention very briefly the concept of green colonialism. Do you still see that playing out today? Is history repeating itself? And more importantly, positively, can we get over it and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just got to do a little quick shout out to emerging leaders. Thank you for getting me here, and for the financial support from Global Affairs Canada. I just wanted to, talking about Indigenous issues, especially when it comes to sustainability. What I have found, and some of my Indigenous colleagues, and even non-Indigenous colleagues, we found that there's not really a lot of Indigenous people at the table at conferences like these, and this is one of the best conferences by far I've seen for Indigenous representation, so shout out to Arctic Frontiers on that. But yeah, we need to see more Indigenous people like ourselves here talking about Indigenous people and Indigenous issues, Indigenous opportunities, whatever it is. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, because I think that's really important to mention that when we're talking about global issues and Indigenous people, we need to be here and we need to have a voice. To answer your question though, green colonialism, yeah, that's a very fascinating question. So I'm from Canada, and the example I like to tell people that I see is the example that's repeating itself, or history is repeating itself with the green transition is the fur trade. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the fur trade in Canada. Long story short, Europeans obviously came to Canada, worked with the Indigenous people across the land, and they found out that, hey, beaver pelts, all the other furs are very valuable in Europe. And so instead of working, in a fair way, they took advantage of Indigenous people and, paid pennies on the dollars for these furs, took them back to Europe and sold them for thousands of dollars and made tons of money. And the example my mom gives is the Hudson Bay Company. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. I believe it is the oldest corporation in North America. It's been around since, I think, the 1500s, maybe even 1400s, I can't remember, but definitely the 1500s, I believe. Yeah, that institution, that corporation is still here, and the reason why they are is because they made so much money from the fur trade hundreds of years ago. Not today, hundreds of years ago. And yeah, we're starting to see that kind of playing out, not just in Canada, but across the world with Indigenous people, where we have non-Indigenous people coming into our communities, into our lands, and saying, we're going to do this. And we were talking about impact benefit agreements yesterday. And Canada seems to be ahead of the curve globally when it comes to that in terms of sharing the value that's created from these green projects. But unfortunately, it's a very, very small percentage. And yeah? Okay. Sorry, I get really passionate about this. But yeah, it's a very small percentage. And from what we've seen with my company, it's typically less than 10%. And when you're generating a lot of wealth, a lot of value, and helping the world, and you only get a small fraction of that, and that's just not fair for our people, and we're seeing that happen again in kind of the modern fur trade with the green transition.
You say it's not fair. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you create a fairer system? If you had that sort of magic wand and that one seat at the table and you could make all these decisions, how do you create that fairer system? And what is an acceptable price to pay for development? Because you and I were chatting yesterday, and you said quite often people say Indigenous people are the ones blocking progress. They're putting up all kinds of obstacles. Is that fair?
What was your first question?
How do you create that fair system?
Yeah. So I'm going to shamelessly plug my company. This is what we're solving. So, what we've identified, and actually I can answer both questions right off the hop. Indigenous people are always seen as the ones that are creating barriers when it comes to change like this. And, we don't want to do that, but, we realize that we have to do it the right way. And just, kind of forcefully trying to do things and do things really quickly, do things without consultation, sometimes consent, you name it. That's a really big issue, and that's why Indigenous people, not just in Canada, but across the world, stand up and are pushing back against this stuff. And for me, the ironic thing is, and this is obviously my opinion, but I obviously know my culture. If I had to give you just one example of what explains my culture, it's Mother Earth, right? Mother Earth provides us sustenance, and I think a lot of non-Indigenous people take advantage of that, and for us, that doesn't sit right with us. One thing I want to mention before I answer the first part of your question is, culturally, I guess if I could share, not a cultural teaching, but some insight into my culture. I'm a hunter, and so when I go hunt for a moose, get the moose, get the meat, I get everything I can out of that moose. I try to take 100% of that moose home, And, one of the things I see, not just in Canada, but also I've kind of noticed in Norway is, electricity. Everybody's talking, oh, we need to get more wind farms. We need to get more solar farms. We need to do all this stuff. But it's like, well, why aren't we talking about efficiency? Why aren't we talking about eliminating energy waste, right? If I went hunting and I only took half the meat home from the moose, and then next week I was like, oh, I got to go get another moose. It's like, well, that moose just died for no reason, right? I could have got another 2 weeks of meat out of that moose. And so, yeah, I think, I'm not saying we don't need renewable energy projects and stuff like that, but we need to talk about efficiency and how important that is. But to answer your question, sorry, trying to give some backstory here. My company, what we're doing is we're bridging the gap between Indigenous people and businesses. The reason being, Indigenous people want to get into tech. They know that's where the money's at, that's the future's at, but specifically clean tech and climate tech. And, sorry, this thing is just... they want to get into clean tech and climate tech projects and companies because that fits with us culturally. We want to do that stuff. We don't want to do things that are harming the world and Mother Earth. And so... but we've noticed businesses also want to work with Indigenous people. And, I can't speak so much about the Sami, but I've learned a lot about it this past week. And, there's nuances, though, whether it's business nuances, talking about, profit and stuff. Mox is going to be like, oh, shit, talking about profit. Just teasing. But, basically, we're bridging the gap between the two parties, and we know that they want to work with each other, and there's cultural nuances that I understand being Native, and I've worked in tech the past 10 years. And so that's what our company is doing, is we're getting Indigenous people and businesses at the table and helping them understand both sides and translating that.
Okay, thanks, Chip. Donovan, Alaska faces quite a unique set of challenges, not just the vast landscapes, but dispersed populations, and also the fact that it is fossil fuel dominated and dependent. How difficult is it then to decarbonize in such an environment?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay? I moved my mic earlier, so I want to make sure. Thanks for having me. Thank you to Arctic Frontiers. Thanks to the organizers specifically. This is an amazing convening. Thanks, Hirta. Just to give a bit of background on our organization as well, we're Renewable Energy Alaska Project, and so we're a membership-based coalition of utilities, independent power producers, renewable developers, but then also Alaska Native entities, other NGOs, educational institutions, local governments, all working towards achieving our mission of driving the development of what we call clean energy, which is the combination of renewable energy and energy efficiency across Alaska. And so we do that through energy education, workforce development and capacity development, community engagement, and then policy advocacy. So to your question, in the state of Alaska, that is historically an oil and gas producer, we do sort of come up against this ethos and mindset of resource extraction and sort of this oil and gas production. But there is an important distinction between the energy that we produce and export and the energy that we use within our state. And so we actually don't, my colleague, our executive director, likes to say that we don't get a hometown discount in Alaska. We actually export all of those raw commodities that we produce from the North Slope and then ship out from Valdez. And so we actually, we are careful to talk about our own energy supply as our local energy needs. And so as you mentioned, our 250 remote communities. We've got abundant renewable energy resources, but unfortunately we have been dependent on imports of foreign fossil fuels in the form of diesel fuel for many decades now. And so it's really, comparatively pretty easy to talk to our Alaskan neighbors about the importance of developing our local renewable energy resources, not only for the purposes of affordability of energy and the economic opportunities that come from that, but then also the importance of energy sovereignty and being able to sort of break yourself from that dependence on external partners when it comes to your energy needs.
So Donovan, let me ask you, on a practical level, I mean, how much of a risk is there that even the most well-intentioned projects could have that unintended harm when it comes to local ways of life? Yeah, how much does that factor into the thinking when you develop these projects, and how do you avert this? Is it just part of the reality?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question because the nature of our remote communities in Alaska is such that they're very small and there's not a lot of what you would think of as an economic base in these communities. And so this is sort of about the cost of going green, and within that is finance, and so we can get into the discussion on how you fund these projects. But a lot of times, at least to get these projects off the ground, there's a lot of grant funding that goes into it. And so the entities that come together that apply for these grants and try to develop these project ideas are predominantly local entities. And so I won't say that this is entirely because of the work that our organization does, but I'll take a step back and just say that we are grounded in the approach that my partners here on the stage have really advocated for, and that's instead of thinking top down, we think inside out. And so we start from the foundation of our energy education and community engagement to try and cultivate local energy literacy and capacity within communities to take the inventory of what renewable energy resources they have available to them and what opportunities they have to either apply for funding or work with a trusted partner to develop that resource for community benefit. So we could talk about urban Alaska, it's a bit different, but in our 250 rural and remote communities, that's how we see the path to success, not only for this energy transition that will help us to mitigate the impacts of climate, but also to cultivate local energy sovereignty, bring down the cost of energy, and sort of present and provide local economic development opportunities into the future.
So Eli, back to you.
Yes.
You want to comment on this, and
yes,
then I may
please.
have a follow-up that also is coming from the audience.
Yes, and I think I've missed your question on benefit sharing, so I'd like to follow up on that, because I think the concept of benefit sharing with the indigenous peoples, it's more developed on the other side of the Atlantic than on this side of the Atlantic. So it's interesting to learn more about how it could be done. But what I think is very important to remember is that benefit sharing should not be like coercion, corruption, which would further disturb the transition. That is really important. That we follow the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, and that we have transparency and trust and leadership also when it comes to benefit sharing. The situation for indigenous peoples in the Nordic, in Northern Europe, and in the Americas is really different. What we have here, at least in the Nordic states, is really good infrastructure. So we have access to energy. But what we have in common, I think, is the consequences of climate change. And that we have to rely on the nature around us. And also the understanding that self-determination and fate control for indigenous peoples are really, really important to move forward. And I'd like to comment also on the insurance thing, because you brought some new thoughts to me. In a Sami context, our insurance is the land, because I don't think there's any insurance companies in the Nordics that are willing to insure a reindeer herd. So we have to have flexibility on land use to have that kind of economic and cultural security. So the thought that insurance companies would insure also indigenous activities, indigenous livelihood, is kind of strange to me, but very interesting. Thanks.
Could I just touch on one piece really quick too? Maybe two. But I want to connect a few points too. I really appreciated what Max was saying earlier about it boiling down to commitment, and the folks who are most committed to mitigating the impacts of climate change are indigenous communities, right? They're on the front lines, and they also have been doing the work to try and do this responsibly and do this the right way for decades, right, for generations. And so I think we really bring that to our work to try and, again, it's like we could get into how this is funded, and I think this is a really important conversation to have too, because you mentioned like there are steps that need to be taken to sort of break business as usual approach, so that we can, we were talking about breaking the wheel and making sure that the history does not repeat itself going forward. We have this opportunity through the green transition to do things right and empower indigenous communities to help lead. And so I think that's what our energy literacy and community engagement programming is all grounded within. And then one important thing I want to talk about too is just the fact that the sort of communities that we engage with in Alaska that are off-grid, they have their microgrids, but they're not connected to a broader regional grid. They have between, it ranges, but maybe a dozen to up to a couple thousand people, relatively small. They have their own economic challenges when it comes to funding these sorts of projects. We've got ideas for how we can try and basically adopt a regional approach where you bring collaboration throughout the region across communities who have led these project development ideas and hopefully apply for funding in a more sustainable way than just sort of like one-time grants. But just contextually, there's a real opportunity here where if we hone this model, over 1 billion people on the face of the planet live in communities just like these, where they're distributed, they run on microgrids, and they have local renewable energy resources, but they don't have the sort of private funding available to them yet. And so this is a real opportunity for the Arctic to lead if we can really get this right and hone this model to bring it to the rest of the world and not only transition our existing energy systems, but then also bring clean, affordable, renewable energy to people who don't have electricity yet. So I think it's really exciting. But
and how we get there and what kind of wheels are needed. Richard, a question to you from the audience. How do you make sure that indigenous needs are at the wheel and not a greenwashing passenger?
So I was just going to comment on the indigenous, the land is your endurance. Again, if I've done my job properly, everyone will come away with some thought around what endurance can and can't do. There's parametric products today which are designed to be extremely simple, very clean cut, and if an event happens and it hits certain criteria, money is paid immediately. So one thing that Gallagher Re broke was when the Moroccan earthquake happened, money was paid immediately because the earthquake was of such a severity in such an area that local communities immediately got money to pay for what they needed to fix that problem as quickly as they could for them and their families. So, and there's some of the products which aren't related to the green transition, admittedly, but that I've seen recently are blowing my mind. I've seen a product that insures IVF in the last few weeks. I've seen a product that insures carbon credits for airlines in the last few weeks. There's solutions all over the place that you can kind of get to. And if you think the oldest insurance companies are mutuals, that's born out of farmers, land, communities who said, if we all pull together, the claims of a few can be covered by the many. That's the underlying principle of insurance. So in terms of indigenous communities, insurance can be a vehicle to seize control. You can have your own insurance vehicle of sorts, and you can use that to govern who's doing what on your land. Okay, wind farms going up. Well, we always have to insure everything in this area because that's the rule that we've agreed. Has that wind farm got certain contracts agreed? Is it correct? Are we fine with them moving ahead? There's always ways that you can use it, and the soft governance around insurance is often overlooked, and it's really important to think about that.
Chip, you wanted to comment on anything that you heard?
Yeah, I mean, when I heard the question, I heard greenwashing, and I think one of the things that I don't know if I'm coining this, and I'm stealing this from my mom right now, but she's my business partner, by the way. Indigenous washing. That seems to be, I think, happening, and Richard just mentioned about the carbon markets. There's a lot of carbon projects that are on indigenous lands or working with indigenous people, and it's supposed to benefit them. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the green colonialism. But there's some indigenous washing that's happening in the carbon markets and just in business in general, renewable energy projects, you name it. It's like, oh, it's indigenous, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, how are they being or how are they working with indigenous people? How is it benefiting them? And it's not just financial thing. I think that's a big thing I need to emphasize with non-indigenous people is everybody, when they think about value or wealth, they think about money, and indigenous people don't think about that. It's obviously a factor in our daily lives, but that's not something that we primarily care about. And so I guess, yeah, just, I'm trying to answer the question in terms of like we need to be cautious of not just greenwashing when it comes to indigenous people, but indigenous washing of projects.
So just finally, before I just get everyone's final remarks as well, 3.5 minutes is what we have. You said earlier that the current framework for consultation isn't adequate, if I understood you.
Yeah.
Neither is the consent framework, is it? How do you improve these?
Yeah.
And again, briefly, how would you?
Yeah, I know, I'll be brief. If I had to answer this, I would say non-Indigenous people need to genuinely want to work with Indigenous people. We're not a checkbox. We're humans. We have lives, we have cultures that are very valuable to us, and you can't summarize that in a checkbox and say, oh yeah, well, we talk to them. It's all good. What we care about is genuine relationships, and to be completely frank, we can tell who is not genuine and who is. So, yeah.
Donovan, to you, in a few seconds, how do you create that trust?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the status quo framing is that you're, a private or a public actor who's trying to come to a community and cultivate trust, whereas it should be community-led, and inherent in that is the trust among community members, right? So I think it's, just to reframe the question a little bit, it's like if it should be the community who has a sense for the resources available to them and has a Northern Star in terms of they've brought together the relevant stakeholders to sort of align around a vision, and then they should build trust with developers or manufacturers who can provide them the capital, whether it's the materials themselves or the financing necessary to develop these projects once they are leading and aligned around this vision. So I think it's build trust in the way that you can work together, but have it being led by the folks in the community themselves.
Richard, how have these conversations informed your thinking as you take on the next project?
Communication is everything. Sit down and talk, and think about the best way, to Mox's point, of figuring out action. Don't get just frozen in the abyss of what's right, what's wrong. Be willing to give a bit for the benefit of as many people as possible, but ultimately understand each other and find a solution, because there is a solution. And once you've got the solution, run towards it. Don't try and find more problems.
Thank you. Eilidh, to you. You've got plenty of time. You've got a full minute. So let me ask a question. Maybe a little provocative to say that renewable energy projects could be instruments of oppression against Indigenous peoples, but how do you avert that from happening? I mean, is the glass half empty or half full for you? Keeping in mind what the past has brought and what the future might bring, I'll throw in quick thoughts from the audience as you conclude. After previous human rights violations, it's hard to trust companies and innovation and have a constructive dialogue. How can the government and business build trust from the Indigenous and local communities? And how can they also be responsible after gaining this trust? So again, to the issue of trust.
Well, I have to point to our report, Amnesty's and Sami Council's report, because we give recommendations that are in line with how we see the state's human rights obligations. So human rights offer, it can be a leading light, and the Human Rights Toolbox also offers tools like the free, prior, and informed consent that will get us on the way. And if we are in a hurry, and I think we all agree that we are in a hurry, it's a matter of time, then we are in a hurry also to implement those systemic solutions really fast to get further.
Thank you very much. On this positive note, thank you all for helping us find the way, not just look at the problems, but more importantly, find the solutions. Thank you. Andreas.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening discussion, to all of you also here. I hope you're still committed to Arctic Frontiers, with a couple of more side events, also discussing the cost of going green, energy transition, the question of hydrogen. So again, please be committed to Arctic Frontiers. The costs are rather low or have already been paid and covered. So see you later at 3:30 here at the main stage for the last big picture, and until then, enjoy the side events.
Meticulous work, removing layers of snow and fern before reaching the deeper, more stable layers of ice. Each layer of snow has its own chemistry and texture, summer snow differing from winter snow. The new ice core from northeast Greenland will provide an invaluable climate archive, including a 100,000-year-long history of changes in temperature and greenhouse gases trapped in the ancient snow. Observing deformation of the cores and boreholes will tell scientists more about the dynamics and motion of the ice. Deep down, these close to 3,000 meters of glacier ice shape a vertical timeline of past climates. But before revealing the secrets of the ice, a lot of preparations need to be done. The Greenland climate is harsh, but still, the temperature of the surface is too warm for the scientists to work on the ice cores without damaging them. To protect the ice cores from melting, they need to be analyzed and stored in large tunnels below the ground. Inflatable balloons, the size of a large bus, are dug down and covered with snow. After a few hours in the cold climate, the snow roof stabilizes and the balloons can be deflated. The researchers now have the perfect base for carrying out their work.